Okay, so cholera was basically in the early 19th century confined to the Indian subcontinent. It spread gradually westwards. Then in Belfast, after months of distressing reports from Europe mainland, cholera arrived. The Great Cholera Epidemic of 1832 was the most virulent pestilence to affect Ireland since the Black Death in the 14th century. But now, even though 50,000 people died, over 50,000 people died from cholera, it is now almost forgotten, overshadowed, eclipsed by the Great Famine of 1845. Now, we often hear people saying today, going forwards, seems to be a ubiquitous phrase. I'm going backwards in this talk, okay? So the only way to understand what's going on is to tell you what cholera is like today and then go backwards. So the structure of my talk is I'm going to talk about what cholera is today. I'm going to try to explain it to you in layman's terms what it's like. And then we're going to talk about the cholera in Belfast in 1832. Third part of my talk, I'm going to talk about the role of religion in response to cholera. And finally, and gloomily, the disposal of the dead. So, this is a very pretty slide of what is a pretty deadly microbe. This is the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, and it produces a very nasty toxin which attacks the cells of the intestines. And that produces the signature symptom of cholera, which is diarrhea. Now, it's not just any old diarrhea, we're talking about catastrophic and cataclysmic diarrhea. Now, we've all had diarrhea from time to time in this room. Mostly it'll be rotavirus or norovirus. And I'm sure, like me, we've sat on the toilet for the umpteenth time some particular day thinking, oh God, I'm going to die. But we never actually do. So if you can recall the worst episode of diarrhea that you've ever had, multiply that by 100, you begin to get some idea of what it would be like to have cholera. The disease is transmitted primarily by drinking infected water, but you can pass it on from person to person. It primarily occurs in settings where there's inadequate sanitation, inadequate sewage disposal, and unclean water. For example, parts of Africa and parts of India. And even today, every year, about 100,000 people worldwide will die of cholera. It also occurs in populations where the infrastructure has been destroyed. For example, the Haiti earthquake of 2005, and also in the 19th century in times of war. Most people wouldn't know this, but I think, but during the 19th century wars, more soldiers died from infections, particularly cholera, than died from cold steel or from bullets. Now, I know you've all come here at lunchtime on Wednesday to hear more about diarrhea, okay? And I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail about diarrhea. Diarrhea is extremely profuse. Initially, it's the usual brown feculent material, but then eventually you start passing large quantities of what is described as rice water. The diarrhea is so severe that the body literally empties of fluid, and when that happens, your blood pressure drops like a stone. When that happens, the circulation of blood ceases, blood stops going through the lungs, it doesn't get oxygenated, and deoxygenated blood is blue. Hence the appellation, the Blue Death. Patients turn blue before they die. So this is a 19th century representation of a poor and unfortunate woman who has developed cholera and is almost certainly about to die. Death often follows really quickly, sometimes within a few hours of the first symptoms. In the recent Haitian earthquake, the average time between symptoms and death was only 12 hours. The mortality in untreated cholera is extremely high. It's 50 to 70%. What that means is that out of every 100 people who contract cholera, 50 to 70 will die. Now, to put that into context, we've recently gone through a pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. The mortality there was less than 1%. So what that means is out of every 200 people who would contract COVID-19, just one would die, and they would nearly all be my age or a bit older. Now, the main treatment for cholera is to bucket in fluids. Patients have bucketed out fluids. It's logical, you bucket in fluids. So aggressive rehydration is extremely successful, and it reduces the mortality right down from 70% to about 0.5%. Now, what we're going to see shortly is that in the 19th century, a lot of the treatment was directed at doing exactly the opposite to that. And they were removing fluids, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. Now, unfortunately for victims of cholera, death is not peaceful. Death is agonizing. The body is contorted with severe muscle spasms. The reason for this is that the patients have not only lost a large amount of fluid, but they've also lost important minerals such as salt, potassium salts, and bicarbonate, and this throws the muscles into severe and agonizing spasms. So just to read a contemporary account of, this is a 19th century account of a man dying from cholera. The poor fellow lay on his wretched pallet, with his thighs drawn up towards his abdomen. Arms and legs were thrown into violent spasms. The agony produced by which raised his voice to its highest pitch. His countenance was expressive of the greatest mental agony, every feature contracted and sharp. Now, we're moving backwards from the 21st century just to about halfway through the 19th century. And in 1854, Dr. John Snow had a theory that cholera was being spread around by infected water. The water was being contaminated with sewage, and that was how people were getting it. So to test his theory, there was an outbreak in Soho in London, and he got the handle of the pump removed. And when that happened, the cholera outbreak subsided, essentially proving his theory. Shortly after that, in 1861, Louis Pasteur looked down a microscope and for the first time saw microbes and proposed a germ theory for disease. Now, subsequently, prevention and treatment of infectious disease, including cholera, became a lot better and a lot safer. Now, to move on to the second part of my talk, Belfast in 1832 was a wealthy and prosperous city based on industries of linen and shipbuilding. There was a shortage of workers, and people poured in from the countryside, from rural areas. They were extremely poor, and they had poor nutrition. The population increased rapidly just over a few years, from about 10,000 10 years previously to about 50,000 in 1832. Now, this is a cracking picture of Belfast in 1832, and it gives the impression of wealth and style. But behind that facade, the conditions were, by today's standards, absolutely shocking. There was no clean water supply, there was sewage in the streets. The Blackstaff River was nothing more than an open sewer. Cholera's first case in Belfast occurred on the 28th of February 1832, when Bernard Murtagh first started to experience symptoms. He was in a boarding house in Quay Lane, which I believe was near the River Lagan, and he almost certainly contracted the disease from Scottish travellers who were staying in the same house. Within 19 hours, Bernard was dead. The disease then spread rapidly in this environment through a population which had been weakened by gross poverty, weakened by a recent typhus epidemic, and weakened also by a famine of 1821-1822. So what exactly were the doctors going to do about this terrible situation? Well, to explain this to you, I need to explain exactly what doctors knew in the 19th century. It was entirely different from what happens now in the upper age. So basically, so please don't try to understand this too much. Don't ask me too many questions about it, because I sat my exams in 1832. I definitely was fitting them. I just can't quite get my head around it. So they believed that there were four essential fluids in the body: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And that these were called the humours. And if they were in balance, you were well. If they're out of balance, you weren't well. They also believed that the humours influenced personality. So some of the words that were used survive to this day. We've heard the people being in bad humour or people being in good humour, and this is where it comes from. Also, you may have used the word phlegmatic, which means cold and unemotional. You might probably not have used the word bilious, but it's, I'm looking forward myself to an opportunity to use it. But it means bad-tempered and spiteful. The other one, which is more commonly used today, is sanguine. So sang comes from the French word for blood. One of the humours, and someone who is sanguine has too much blood and is optimistic. There's also a bit of astrology thrown into the mix as well. So their explanation of infections was that these were spread by a noxious, invisible vapor called a miasma, or night air. And that was basically what they believed. So, moving to the archives of the Linen Hall Library to find out how the docs were treating the patients in 1832 for this shocking disease. So this is basically a little treatise on how to treat cholera. Now, the first bits, let me see, is my pointer working? It doesn't appear to be working. doesn't matter. Anyway, the first paragraph is mostly stuff that like your mother would tell you when you were a young teenager. Don't go out at night, go to bed early, eat properly, dress warmly, have a good breakfast before you go out in the morning, etc., etc. The rest is a list of not drugs, but stuff that was used to treat. So we have something called sulfuric ether, which doesn't sound very pleasant to me, but I can assure you that you won't get any in the pharmacy. Now, today, aromatic spirits of hartshorn, that is male deer horn ground down into powder, cinnamon, etc., etc. There is morphine, which is in those days was referred to as laudanum or opium, some of them. Clysters, which is an archaic word for enemas. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The mustard poultice. So if you can cast your mind back to that lovely little picture of the cholera bacterium. So we have a battle here between the cholera bacterium and the mustard poultice. Can you imagine which one came out on top? Hot herb baths, and the last one is sent to the doctor, which unfortunately would not be much help. I'm so sorry. Right, so another form of treatment used was bloodletting. And here we have an individual who is being bled by the application of leeches. And the idea being that there was an imbalance in the humours, one of which was blood, and maybe if we took some blood away, that might balance them up again. However, wrong thing to do, as we know, because you need to put fluids in, not take them out. And just before we move on from this slide, how dandy the doctor looks. If you got to any in the world, there'd be no one like that, I don't think. Has anyone any idea what this is and what it's for? Sorry? Yes. Have we got one at home? Yeah, this is an enema syringe, and they liked nothing more in the 19th century than a jolly good enema. In fact, it's been going on for hundreds of years. You might be able to know that Louis XIV had over 2,000 enemas during his reign, and some of them were carried out while he was holding court. And you might also be interested to know that aristocratic enemas were delicately tinted and delicately scented. So, no such enemas in Belfast in 1832. The recipe here is given as a pint of arrowroot, glass and a half of whiskey. Irish or Scotch is not specified. Some laudanum, that's a type of morphine. You heat it up as hot as the patient will endure it. And you fire it up in, and if it comes out, as they seem to think happens quite often, and hardly surprising, you just get another one, you fire it in, you keep on firing it in. What that would do would be to induce the loss of more fluids, this time from the back passage, and it would have been exactly the wrong thing to do. So, a lot of this took place in the Belfast Cholera Hospital, which was in Frederick Street, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's off York Street, and I believe it was a street that went up the side of the old co-op. Is that right? Thank you. And in Frederick Street Hospital, the response was spearheaded by a doctor called Dr. Henry McCormick, who was extremely organised and ran the hospital with a rod of iron, and was described as formidable. The treatments that he employed included these: bloodletting, opiates, which is morphine, which is actually not a bad idea. Now that is not a misprint, and you are seeing correctly sulfuric acid. Sort of thing you might buy to remove cement from today. You buy it in a DIY shop to remove cement from tiles. He swore by sulfuric acid, dilute sulfuric acid. And he also used mercury salts, which a lot of the doctors were using. And of course, we know that mercury salts are highly poisonous. So is it any surprise to anybody that the mortality in the hospital was 3 times greater than if you stayed at home? So you're building up a picture of what the doctors were doing in those days, and it probably won't surprise you either to know that the doctors became increasingly unpopular in 1832. And it wasn't just because they were poisoning people. There was another separate issue, which had nothing to do with cholera. And that issue was that there were 2 big medical schools in Scotland, one in Glasgow and one in Edinburgh. And they had an insatiable desire for corpses. And what they would do is they'd pay ne'er-do-wells to fetch corpses from them from somewhere. The said ne'er-do-wells would then go to a graveyard in the middle of the night, dig up a fresh grave, get the corpse, and sell it to the docks in the hospitals. And this was going on in Belfast at the time. Friars Bush Cemetery routinely had a man with a weapon and a dog guarding graves at night. Because corpses were being taken down to High Street and shipped off to the aforesaid doctors in Glasgow and Edinburgh. So doctors were not popular, and reading from an account of a patient with cholera at that time, a Mr. Kirkpatrick, quote, "In the evening, medical personnel from the Board of Health were surrounded by a furious crowd at his house, chanting, 'There go the poisoners,' and they had to be rescued by police reinforcements." So much for the docs. We'll now turn part 3 of my talk to the role of religion in response to cholera. And I would have to say I was surprised looking through the archives of the Linen Hall, the very, very prominent part that religion played in the texts to do with the treatment of cholera. And this would be an example. So this is a book on how to treat cholera. The entire first half is written by a minister. It contains mainly quotes from the Old Testament, and it's basically a sermon. The second half is by a physician, but the physician can't resist chiming in with little homilies on sobriety and morals. So he gives 2 case histories. E.M., aged 18, a young woman of moral and religious habits and of a sound and healthy constitution, was on Sunday the 24th of June, when at divine service, seized about 2:00 p.m. with purging and inclination to vomit. So she had developed cholera. She received all the treatment, the treatment we just talked about, and she survived, okay? Second case history. As a complete contrast to this case, I shall mention that of a woman of a character directly the reverse. Immoral, irreligious, and of the most profligate habits, in every particular. Needless to say, she went down the plug hole. Another text is a DIY book on how to treat yourself if you get cholera. Maybe you can't afford to go to the doctors. Remember how the doctors dressed in those days. Every man his own doctor. Recipes for the cure and prevention of cholera morbus. Morbus is the Latin word for disease. And it seems to hold out some hope that you might be able to get over it. However, the final sentence is a quote from the Old Testament. It concludes, "Prepare to meet thy God." Thank you to the Ulster Museum for allowing me access to this mass card, which I find rather poignant, very poignant. Some poor family were using this to try and ward off this shocking disease in 1832. I've just enlarged the first bit so you can read it. To be attached to the inner door of houses in order that the inmates may be preserved from cholera and all other misfortunes. Of interest also is that the mass card itself contains a list of disasters that could befall people in the 19th century. Those disasters include heresies and schisms. For those who maybe don't know, schism is a splitting of the church due to doctrinal differences. So this is Dr. Daniel Murray, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Dublin in 1823, and the Board of Health in Dublin had this idea that wakes were not a good idea. Maybe the disease was being spread because of wakes, so they tried to enlist Dr. Murray's help in stopping wakes. So they asked him to write to his flock to get them to stop having wakes. Dr. Murray's pastoral letter, I believe, was in Latin, but it's been translated here. And I won't read it out, but you can see basically what he was saying was that he saw the appearance of cholera in Dublin as a terrible manifestation of God's judgment on the people. And this must have increased terror in many hearts. So we've a triumvirate of a very deadly disease, a lethal disease. The doctors hadn't a clue what they were doing. It was worse than that. The treatment they were giving were making people worse, and there was no reassurance from religion. So understandably, there was shocking panic throughout Ireland, and this gave rise to a phenomenon which maybe some of you have heard of, called the Blessed Turf. Has anybody heard of that? Right, okay. Well, I'm glad, because I had no idea about the Blessed Turf until I read it in contemporary literature. So the Blessed Turf is best explained by a school teacher at the time, Humphrey O'Sullivan, in 1832, who described it. I'll read it out because maybe the letters are a little too small. The lower classes of the Irish are a credulous people. Some practical joker sent a fool out with a small piece of charred stick which had been extinguished in holy water. I told him to divide it into 4 parts and give it to 4 persons in 4 houses. telling them that the cholera would kill them unless each one of them did the same thing. So it was in fact a bit of a pyramid scheme. By this means 16 and 64, 256, etc., 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 got this far until the entire country was a laughing stock for Protestants. So for the fourth and final part of my talk, I'm going to discuss the disposal of the dead. And before I do so, quite apart from the cholera, there was a problem burying people in the early part of the 19th century in Belfast. The graveyards were full, it was pretty grim, and I'm just setting the scene that before cholera even arrived, there was a problem burying people, and these are extracts from a letter in the newsletter in around the same time, which I'll read out. Sir, on last Monday it was my melancholy duty to accompany a funeral to the shackle, when I saw two coffins quite bare, and the entire side of a third, which had been laid down there that day, was quite exposed, on a lid of which there was not more than 2 inches of earth. The grave opened for the individual's remains was not more than 1.5 feet deep. On the top of a coffin, about half decomposed. And at another funeral which I lately attended, the grave opened presented a truly sickening sight. So shallow was it that I do not think the end of the coffin could be covered. In many parts of the yard, there's scarcely a green sod over the coffins. I was also horror-struck at beholding almost every grave, particularly the newly made ones, present the appearance of a rabbit burrow, in consequence of the prodigious number of rats that have taken up their abode among the slumbering ashes of the dead. On the whole, had I not seen it for myself, I could not have believed that Ulster contained such a place as the burial grounds of the shackle. So, in 1832, there were a lot of people dying, and there was basically nowhere to put them. And the solution was basically digging pits, as they did during the bubonic plague. Large pits were dug to put bodies into. My next slide is going to show a lot of skeletons in the grave. If anybody feels squeamish about that, you don't turn away. To turn away. So this has been an example of a pit for infectious diseases in the early 19th century. Now, the only cholera, there's an acknowledgement of cholera, I think, in the Shankhill graveyard. Another cholera pit that I know of is in the Friars Bush graveyard, and I've had an excellent tour around there by Corsia Nikita. I can highly recommend their tour of Friars Bush. And as you go in at the entrance lodge there on the right of the photo, just immediately to the left is an area that's overgrown, and it is a slight mound, and it's referred to as Plaguey Hill. And in there are buried hundreds of cholera victims, but also hundreds of victims of the Great Famine. I think you can just identify here, there's a memorial plaque, but it mentions only the people who died from the Great Famine. So basically, a lot of people died in Ireland in 1832, but these victims are largely forgotten. Anecdotally, in the part of Northern Ireland where I live, in Glenarm, there is a cholera pit near St Patrick's Church graveyard, but for the life of me I can't find out where it is. None of the locals seem to know exactly where it is. Also, as a lad, an 8-year-old being brought up in Carrickfergus, I remember St Nicholas Church, they were building a new bell tower, and when they dug out the foundations, they came across absolutely hundreds of skeletons. I remember my father taking me to see these piled up in a huge pile in the graveyard, and that was a cholera pit. So these people have largely been forgotten. So in conclusion, the cholera outbreak of 1832, it gradually petered out, but there were 4 further cholera pandemics in Ireland in the 19th century. There was much better understanding of the disease, and the preventative measures, clean water, disposal of sewage were taking place, and the last case of cholera in Ireland was in 1893. Now, if we had some sort of time-travelling way to go out those doors, down to the main library, down the stairs to the front door, and open the doors into Belfast in 1832, I wonder how many of you would be rushing down there to go outside. Because it ain't the world of Jane Austen, and it ain't the world of Downton Abbey. It would be a world of brutal poverty and terrible diseases, of which cholera in the 19th century was probably the worst. But if any of you decide to chance it, my top tips to you would be number 1, whatever you do out there, do not drink any of the water. And number 2, whatever happens, you've got to stay in the hands of the doctors, aka the poisoners. Thank you.